Hello, Marie-Louise. It's great to see you today. And I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your latest project in a few words. What is it about, and what is it that you're doing right now?
Right, so the project's called WellMig. It's about migration into the welfare state. We're focusing on nurses as a profession and on nurses coming to Norway to work from 3 selected countries. So we've got Filipino nurses and Polish nurses and Swedish nurses. And what we do is we've interviewed many nurses from all 3 groups, and we've looked into policy documents, and we've interviewed different kinds of public servants in directorates of migration, of health, and so on. And we've also spoken with people who train, some of them when they're required to take extra training to work here.
So what is it that you are interested in from the interview data? What is it that you're trying to find out?
So from the outset, we were interested in finding out how these three kind of trajectories compared, because they kind of represent 3 different, what we call regimes. So we have the Nordic nurses from Sweden, and then we have the sort of EU nurses from Poland, and then we've got the third country nurses from the Philippines. And obviously there are different regulations, formal regulations that apply to these 3 groups, but there's also different kinds of more informal expectations, and on both sides, people who want to come to Norway to work, why do they want to do it, what are the implications for the countries that they come from, and also a lot of it is about kind of crossing boundaries, crossing different kinds of borders into finally into a Norwegian kind of workplace in a normal work situation in Norway.
Brilliant. So is there anything unexpected in the interview data, something that you didn't think you would find at all?
Well, what struck us is how these are very much sort of human stories. So something is quite predictable, and it is that, it's much easier for a Swedish nurse to come to Norway to work here than it is for a Filipino nurse. But, putting those things aside a little, when you read the interviews and you listen to the people, it's more like, okay, so people live their lives. They try to plan things, but it doesn't come out exactly as planned. Things happen, and it's just life.
Yeah. And in terms of the actual numbers of the nurses, which is the most popular kind of route? Do you have most Swedish nurses, or more from the EU, or Filipino nurses?
It's really hard to tell, because statistics are, a chapter in itself. It's how do you count these people? So what is a nurse? First of all, is it a person who is accepted and authorized to work as a nurse in Norway, or is it a person who is authorized to work as a nurse in their country of origin? So we already have a problem there, right? And then is it people who are actually working as nurses in Norway, or is it people who are nurses and are on the path to become authorized as nurses in Norway, but for now they're working as something else? Is it people who have, maybe come to Sweden from another country and now want to work in Norway with a Swedish nursing education? So it's very difficult to compare the numbers. It's very hard to dig out exactly how many, Filipino, Swedish, and Polish nurses are working in Norway at any point in time. And when it comes to the Swedish nurses, it's sort of the added fun of a lot of them are just commuting.
Right.
So they don't come up anywhere as living in Norway, although they might be working a good deal here, more or less, which we don't really know.
So when you say commuting, you mean how long is the journey?
Well, some of them live just across the border, so for them it's like
right.
They have a job in Norway and they live in Sweden. For many of them, it's not like that. They have what's very common is that they get a job through some kind of a staffing agency, recruitment agency that places them in Norway, but they very often work just limited periods of time in Norway. So maybe they stay here for a couple of weeks, and then their permanent home is still in Sweden. Right, and then they go back and forth a little during the year. They might be here for a few periods, just one, most of the time it varies a lot, and there's just no numbers to really tell us exactly what's happening.
Right. Is there a variation depending on the specialization of care? So like maternity care versus end of life care, or people who are old versus care for children's wards? Do you get kind of specialized differences of any sort?
You could maybe say that most of the nurses that come from, I think probably all three countries, are more used to working in hospitals. Whilst the need in Norway is very much for nurses who want to work in nursing homes for the elderly.
Okay.
And although they have, Sweden has, I'm sure, just as many of those as Norway has, and Poland has, I guess, a few, whereas in the Philippines it's not really a thing. So, for example, nurses who have their full educations from the Philippines and have all their experience from there would be required to do geriatrics, because it's not a big thing in the Philippines. So there are differences of that kind.
Right. In terms of policy recommendations then, from your study, do you have any recommendations for change or anything about best practice in the field?
And we're just working on our policy briefs now, so it might be a bit premature to come with the recommendations. I think I'll hold on to that for a while longer. But we do see some surprising things. I mean, one of the findings that we have is that it's actually, I mean, usually in migration, you know, you expect the migration authorities, where it's called the Home Office, or in Norway it's the Directorate of Migration or of Immigration. They would be sort of the border guards, if you like, you know, deciding who's to enter the country or not. But in this particular field, their immigration is so much dependent on getting a job in Norway, and to get a job in Norway you need to be authorized as a nurse. So in the last instance we find that it's really the Directorate of Health that guards the borders for this professional group, which I think is quite interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So do they, I'm thinking of the UK context now and the hotel environment, document checking responsibilities. So is it sort of like they do document checking, or is it deciding on the numbers for the quotas, or how do they get involved with the bordering functions?
Because it's up to them to okay, let me just sort of describe the process, because it's different for all three groups, right? So if you're a Swedish or a Polish nurse, it's basically the same rules for those, because they're both within the European Economic Area, which is what Norway is. We're not the EU. And they have to apply for authorization as a nurse in Norway, because it's a protected profession. And they will normally get it based on the education from those two countries because of agreements, bilateral or European agreements. But when it comes to the Filipino nurses, they also have to send individual letters of application to Norwegian health authorities, to the Director of Health, and they will get individual, it's like individual casework. So they will get individual, evaluations of their education and experience, with a letter, I think in 100% of the cases, rejecting the first application and stating what they would need to do in order to be accepted and to be authorized. So it's that sort of rejection that really makes it impossible for them to then get a visa to come to work in Norway, because they cannot get a job, and in order to get a visa you have to have a job.
Okay.
Right.
That's fascinating, I think, account. So I think that is great for those who want to study about what are the immigration processes, how do professionals and individuals get drawn into immigration functions, how do specialist routes work, and things, and all kinds of studies. So that's really important. Thank you so much for sharing the study with us, Mary-Louise.
Well, thanks so much for having me on.